every bad thing just ends up working out for her. And so I hated that she does so well, and yet that's partly why I liked so much. I hated it in a good way, right? Hello, and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura. Today I am talking about Mildred Pearce by James M. Cain, published in 1941, and I'm comparing it with the 1945 film directed by Michael Curtis. And I am also going to be talking about the 2011 miniseries directed by Todd Haynes. So I covered Mommy Dearest in September, and that made me want to cover some iconic Joan Crawford movies. So I talked about Whatever Happened to Baby Jane in October, and this month we are talking about Mildred Pearce. And this is also my second James M. Cain novel I have talked about, because just last week I did an episode on Double Indemnity, so definitely check out those previous videos if you have not already. And as far as Mildred Pearce goes, I gave all three of these 4 stars. I highly recommend them. I loved each of them. Joan Crawford won an Oscar for her titular performance, and then same with Kate Winslet. This again was a miniseries, but the year it came out, she swept the TV awards. She won a SAG, a Golden Globe, and an Emmy for her performance. And the TV show is as faithful an adaptation as you could hope for with Mildred Pearce, whereas the 1945 movie does make some significant changes, but part of those, they were kind of forced to make the changes because of the codes in place in Hollywood at the time, which we will get into later in the video. But before I get into the details of the plot, I first wanted to begin with a quote from an article I read about Mildred Pearce. And in this article, they share a quote by James M. Cain about his works in general. And even though in this quote, as they share this Cain quote, they are talking about Mildred Pearce, but the quote they share by him could also be applied to Double Indemnity. But the quote reads, Cain once wrote that his stories always concern the wish that comes true, for some reason a terrifying concept, at least to my imagination. This is as good a description of ambivalence as one is likely to find, and Mildred Pearce proves an object lesson in authorial ambivalence about a central character and her desires. So yeah, I just wanted to share that here at the top, and we can keep that in mind as I get into the details. Another thing, before I get into the details of the plot, I do usually try to dress on theme in some way or other. So yeah, I got this dress, which I think is very, maybe not 1930s, but definitely kind of has a 1940s vibe. It's just a cheap Amazon dress, so the fit is a little weird. But I also have these pie earrings, which are so cute. Pie is actually a huge part of this story because in all three, Mildred, first of all, she sells pies and cakes to her neighbors, but then later, her getting a restaurant owner to sell her pies to his customers is a huge part of the story. And in the book specifically, we hear so much more detail about this process. And we hear so much about the pies and the flavors of the pies and how good Mildred's pies are. And when I was reading this part of the book, I was craving pie like no other. So Thanksgiving cannot come soon enough because this book really made me want some pie. But anyway, from here on out now, I will get into the details of the plot, which means there will be spoilers for all three Mildred Pearces. So in all versions, we see that Mildred is a homemaker who makes pies and cakes, like I said, good enough to be commissioned by her neighbors and friends. And her husband, Bert, has lost his business and money in large part due to the Great Depression, because the story begins in the early 1930s. It's like 1930 or 31. And this, his losing his job, is why she even begins to sell baked goods in the first place, is to kind of make ends meet while they wait for Bert to find something else. But we also find out that Bert is having an affair. And so in the very first interaction we see between Mildred and Bert, we see her kick him out of the house. And I wanted to mention real quick how we find out in the book and the show that Bert, his success, because he owned different properties and things before he was like swindled out of the business and the Great Depression happened. But we find out that his financial success was just due to luck. Like it was nothing that he actually did. He just got lucky. And this is a theme that kind of comes up a lot because we then have Veda, who just gets lucky with her natural talent, which leads her to success. And then we have Monty, who was just lucky being born into a rich family. So Mildred is the only one who isn't lucky and instead works for her success. And again, this theme of working for your success is something that is going to come up a lot. And so yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there, that even Bert didn't work for his success and he just got lucky with it. But anyway, so Bert, he had no money anyhow, but now that Mildred is a single mother, she is really in a bind to make some money to raise her 2 daughters because they have Veda, who is 11. In the book and show, she is 11. In the movie, they age her up and she is like 16. And then they have a younger daughter named Ray, who is around 7. And just to jump ahead a bit, since we're on the topic of Ray, I just want to get this plot detail out of the way, which is that Ray dies. Before Mildred even opens her restaurant, Ray gets sick and dies. And in the book and the 1945 movie, I loved Ray. She was just so adorable and so funny. And so when she dies, it actually hurts. Whereas in the show, for some reason, in the 2011 show, I wasn't quite as attached to Ray for some reason, but the movie and the book, I thought she was fantastic, and I was so sad when she died. Also, in the 45 movie, they name her Kay instead of Ray. Seemed like an unnecessary change, but yeah. But to go back in time once again before Ray dies. So after Bert leaves, Mildred soon gets a job as a waitress at a diner, but she is ashamed of this and does not want Veda to find out because to take tips is something that is looked down on. And let's just address the elephant in the room, or should I say the snake in the room, because Veda is such a conniving, evil snake in every version of this story. And not to give an armchair diagnosis, but to go ahead and give an armchair diagnosis, she kind of comes across like a psychopath. Like the patience she has for some of her schemes and how cruel she can be in her lack of empathy, while also being so deceptive and just beyond manipulative in her desire to be wanted and envied and wanting every nice thing there is with no thought of what it will cost those around her. And now I do want to say that in the book and show, especially the book, there are some weird things with Mildred and her relationship with Veda, which we will get into. But yeah, in all versions, Veda is just so detestable and frustrating. But yeah, Mildred, she loves Veda and she dotes on her. And we hear early on that she says like, oh, Veda has something that I used to think I had, but now I've realized I don't. And she says this after she has gotten her job at the diner, which again, she feels like she had to stoop so low to get that job. So I guess she's saying that Veda has like some sort of pride or dignity that, again, Mildred used to think she has, but now she realizes she doesn't because she was willing to get a job taking tips, you know? And yeah, she is in fear of disappointing Veda. And mind you, Veda is only 11 years old when she gets this restaurant job. And yet again, she is like cowering to Veda, worried about what Veda will think if she finds out. And in large part, her drive to make money, it's not just to help them survive, but it's also in large part to appease Veda's expensive dreams and wants. And Veda is also very creative and artistic. You know, she's very musical, especially in the book and the show. Whereas Mildred, again, her success isn't due to being artistic. It is due to hard work, although one could argue that being a baker and a cook is a form of creativity. But still, Mildred probably also admires Veda's artistic talents and aspirations and admires that Veda would never stoop so low as to work for money. And yeah, Veda is obsessed with wanting to be high class. And while she loves the money Mildred makes, she looks down on how Mildred makes her money, even when Mildred becomes like this awesome businesswoman. And that just seems so old-fashioned. Like, I feel like in today's day and age, like we admire people who come from nothing and work to build up something successful and become rich, right? Like, that's so admirable and impressive. Whereas, yeah, at this time, it was more impressive to just be born in wealth and not have to work for it, which, yeah, I feel like it's flipped these days. At least I can only speak for myself, right? Like, I admire people who can make their own money and create something successful on their own. I admire that more than someone who just came from a rich family. But to move on to Mildred becoming a businesswoman. So this happens when Veda finds out that Mildred works at a diner. And Veda finds this out because she is so sneaky and like digging into Mildred's things. And so she finds out that Mildred works at a diner, and Mildred is embarrassed due to Veda's judgment. But then in the moment, she says that she is taking the job so that she can learn how to run a restaurant because she wants to open her own. And so Veda perks up at this because she hopes this means that they will become rich. But it's funny because when Mildred took the job, she had no intention of opening her own restaurant. That idea just came to her in the moment as a way to defend herself against Veda. But regardless of how this idea came to her, she does eventually open her own restaurant, and it is a huge success. And over time, she even opens up different chains and it becomes, incorporated. And yeah, she just becomes a successful self-made businesswoman. But to move on to Monty, so in the movie, when she has this business proposal, she tells Wally about it, Wally being a family friend who is a lawyer, and he tells her like, oh, I know a guy who owns a property that would be perfect for this restaurant. And this guy is Monty. And so she tells him about her restaurant and he likes her and her idea. And so he agrees to it. And then soon after they start this business relationship, they soon begin a romance. Whereas in the book and show, Mildred meets Monty when he comes into the diner on her last day of work. And she spontaneously runs off to the beach with him when he invites her. And I much preferred this, meet cute versus what happens in the 45 movie, because I just didn't love that Monty was who she had to thank for being able to open a restaurant. Like in the show and in the book, she owed Monty nothing. Like he did nothing to help her succeed in life, right? She did it all on her own. Whereas, in the movie, it's thanks to Monty that she got started in the first place. But anyway, so the two, they spend a romantic few days at the beach and she finds out that he doesn't do anything for work. He just comes from a rich family. So he just loafs around and receives a check every month from the family business. And in the book and the show, when they are driving home from this weekend, she has him stop by her work in progress restaurant to show it off to him. And he had no idea she was opening her own restaurant. He thought she worked at the diner. And so she's like, no, like that was my last day. And so he's very surprised by this and he asks her like, oh, like, why didn't you tell me? And she says, in both book and show at first, she kind of implies like, oh, like due to our ravenous lovemaking, I didn't get a chance to tell you. But then in the book, she follows that up by saying that she thought he would think it was funny if she told him about this. And I really liked this detail because especially at that time, we're talking like 1931, 32, for a woman to be starting her own business, I'm sure it was very laughable for some men, right? And they would have just brushed it off and thought it was just a joke or something, or just been like not taking her seriously, right? And so I thought this was just a very accurate detail that Mildred would have that fear of the kind of reception this news would get from people. But yeah, so in all versions, Monty shows up at her grand opening, and from here on out, the two become lovers and they are together for a number of years. However, through the years, Monty's family business goes bust. Meanwhile, Mildred, her business is doing great. And so Mildred begins to fund Monty's expensive lifestyle. And in turn, Monty will help take care of Veda, so he'll just like drive her around to school and to her piano lessons and kind of spend time with her when Mildred is busy at work. But then one day Veda gets in one of her venomous moods and she tells Mildred, and actually, in the book and the show, this is on Christmas Day when Veda is being such a brat because she didn't get what she wanted for Christmas. And so she uses this opportunity to lash out at Mildred. And she tells Mildred the things that Monty says to her behind Mildred's back, like how he is only with her for the sex and all sorts of other condescending remarks. And this leads to a blowout between Mildred and Veda, both using Monty to hurt the other. And after this, a few days later, Mildred goes to see Monty and she ends things with him, claiming that he is ruining her relationship with Veda. Whereas in the 45 movie, she does end her relationship with Monty. However, it wasn't quite as dramatic because she and Veda didn't have this like argument going on. And instead, like she just feels like Monty is sort of encouraging Veda's snobbish attitude. And so that's why she ends things with him. Also, again, she is supporting him financially. But yeah, so she breaks up with him in all versions. But in the 45 movie, it was a bit less dramatic, I would say. But something else I wanted to mention, while she and Monty are still dating, there is a scene where she gives him some money and he says something like, oh, your paid gigolo thanks you. And she, of course, doesn't like hearing this. And so she says something about it. And he follows that up by being like, well, you're the best piece of tail I've ever had. And this bothers her too. And so she tells him to leave. And then we read, instead of going, he shook his head as though she were incredibly obtuse and launched into a dissertation on the relations between the sexes. The sense of it was that as long as this thing was there, everything was all right. That it was the strongest bond there was, and what he was really doing, if she only had the sense enough to know it, was paying her a compliment. What she really objected to was his language, wasn't it? If he had said it flowery so it sounded poetic, she would have felt differently, wouldn't she? And then Mildred replies telling him, if you told me that and intended it as a compliment, it might have been one. I don't know. Almost anything is a compliment if you mean it. But when you tell me that and it's the only thing you have to tell me, then it's not a compliment. It's the worst thing I have ever had said to me in my life. And I just thought this was a great line and a great scene in the show because, yeah, oftentimes men will say something to a woman in like a sexualized way and they'll claim it's a compliment. And yet again, as Mildred says, like if that's all you're saying, then it's not a compliment. It's insulting. And a woman doesn't need to be a prude in order to be bothered by hearing something like that, right? So yeah, I thought that was a great scene. But also we know that Veda has met Monty's parents, and yet Mildred never has. So this too also enforces Mildred's belief that Monty only sees her as a bank account and a sex object. But yeah, so Mildred ends things with Monty, and then some years pass, and Veda is in her late teens when she blackmails a rich boy's family, claiming to be pregnant with his child. And in the movie, she and the boy had been married, but in the book and show, they'd had premarital sex, and then she says that now she's pregnant. And so she gets the money from this family, but Mildred later finds out that Veda had been lying, and she was never pregnant. She just wanted the money so she could finally get away from Mildred. And the two again have a huge argument, and Mildred kicks Veda out of the house. And also in the book and show, the woman who is the mother to this boy had been a woman that Mildred had interviewed for back before she got her diner job to be a housekeeper for this woman. And now here she is returning to the story yet again all these years later. However, the woman does not recognize Mildred, but Mildred does recognize her. And then yeah, I mentioned Wally a bit earlier, but Wally, again, he is the family lawyer, and he helped Veda concoct this plot. And so we've known since first meeting him that he's kind of shady, because we find out how he backstabbed Bert. And that's one of the reasons Bert went broke and lost his share of the business and whatever, is because Wally went behind his back and betrayed him. And so we know he's not the most trustworthy person. You know, early in the story, in the book and the show, Wally, when he finds out she and Bert have split, he asks her on a date and the two end up having sex. And then from there, he helps her with her business through the years. Even though, as I said, we know from the start that he's a little shady. And in the movie, when he finds out that Mildred is now single, he does hit on her, and he implies that he would be happy to marry her. However, Mildred turns him down. But again, in all three, he is a lawyer who helps Mildred get set up, even though we know he isn't very honest. Also in the 45 movie, he also has his own Mildred chain restaurant as well. And then in the 45 movie, after she kicks Veda out of the house, Bert then takes her to Wally's restaurant, where we see that Veda has become a lounge singer. So she is singing in a skimpy outfit, and Mildred is aghast because she thought working for tips at a diner was demeaning, and yet here is her daughter, right? And so she goes backstage and she tries to convince Veda to come back home, but Veda, of course, tells her no. And then from here, she seeks out Monty, because she's like, you know what? Monty, he has this family mansion that he has been trying to sell, but he has been unsuccessful. And so she wants to buy his family mansion and marry him as a way to lure Veda back to her, because Veda and Monty, they got along great, right? Because they were both high-class snobs, and he had all the connections that she was a fan of. And so yeah, she goes to see him, and Monty right away, he knows that she's only there as a way to bring Veda back to her. And so they basically set this up as like a business proposition. And he's like, fine, we'll get married, we can live in this house, but I want a share of your business. And so that is what they decide in the 45 movie. And Mildred's plan does indeed work, and eventually Veda comes to live with Monty and Mildred in her new mansion. Whereas in the book and the TV show, so when Veda is kicked out of the house, she then ends up becoming a singer, but it is not in a sleazy way. Here, she becomes a soprano who sings on nationwide radio. And so Mildred is very envious that when she kicks Veda out, instead of Veda being destitute and sad and lonely, instead, she becomes super successful. But of course, Mildred still wants to get Veda back, and so she goes to see Veda's music instructor and offers to secretly pay for Veda's lessons. But the music instructor knows what's going on, and he's like, no. Like, I'm not gonna be part of this drama. Like, you're not gonna pay for this. And it's funny because the music instructor, he acknowledges, like, yeah, Veda, she is a horrible person. She's a great singer, but she's a horrible person. And so, yeah, he doesn't let her pay for the music lessons. And so this, from here, again, Mildred seeks out Monty, wanting to buy his mansion and make repairs to it to make it impressive again and marry him as a way to lure Veda to her. And this works. And in the book and show, Veda shows up at their wedding and she even sings a song. And from here on out, Veda lives with Mildred and Monty. And once she moves in with Mildred, Mildred also then takes on all of Veda's expenses all over again, as well as Monty's. And then the book and show have a different ending than the 45 movie, so I'm just going to wrap up the book and the TV show. So Mildred becomes obsessed with Veda and her music career. Like, she had always been obsessed with Veda, but now that she is a successful singer, there is just so much more for Mildred to be distracted by in regards to Veda's life. And so when people try to talk to her about something about the business, Mildred just brushes them off because all she cares about is Veda. Meanwhile, again, her personal bills are getting higher and higher because she bought this expensive house. She is making repairs to this house. And again, she is funding Monty and Veda's expensive lifestyle. And this all leads to Wally having a meeting with Mildred and a group of creditors who say that Mildred is in the red and they threaten to take her to court. And so Mildred, she talks to Bert and he's like, you know what? You need to get money from Veda because she's making good money, but she's paying for nothing. You're paying for everything. So he's like, you need to go talk to Veda, get some money from her so you can stay in control of your business. And also, you should warn Veda because they're like, Wally is trying to swindle you out of money. He swindled Bert out of money. He might try to swindle Veda out of money. So she rushes home to talk to Veda when what does she discover? But Veda naked in bed with Monty. And when she sees them, Monty has his bit talking about how like, you were just using me as live bait to get Veda. And, you know, it's your own fault that the bait fell in love with the catch or the prey or however he phrases it. And as he's going on about this, we see Veda just so smug, lying in bed, not caring at all how this is making Mildred feel. And then she gets out of bed completely naked and Mildred attacks her and she starts to strangle her, but Monty pulls her off. However, her strangling Veda causes Veda to lose her voice and she can no longer sing. And so from here, we then flash forward and we see that Mildred divorces Monty, of course, and she then remarries Bert, who she has fallen in love with all over again. And in the book specifically, Veda lives with Mildred, and so they're on good terms despite all of that. But yeah, Veda, she can't talk, like she'll like whisper things she has to say, or she'll mime what she's talking about. And she'd had a contract in LA, but that had to be canceled and void because she could no longer sing. And so one day, you know, the family is gathered together and Veda is like, you know, miming, whispering what she is trying to say to people when then a taxi shows up. And suddenly Veda, in a perfectly fine voice, is like, oh, that taxi is for me. And we find out that she lied about not being able to sing and that she used Mildred strangling her as a way to get out of her LA contract. That way she could sign a contract with a company in New York City and she could move to the other side of the country. And we see all of this in the TV show as well. But in the TV show, after she strangled Veda, Veda was not living with her. So they had not had any contact. But then after she marries Bert, Veda shows up and she reveals to them that she is going to New York City and she's speaking totally fine. And so Mildred, she pieces it all together being like, was your voice ever lost? Like, have you been lying this whole time? Like, she just realizes the deception that Veda has been playing. And so in the book, it was definitely much more blatant because one minute Veda is miming her words and the next minute she's speaking totally normal. Whereas, yeah, in the show, she hadn't even been around Veda, but she had heard that Veda could no longer sing, right? And that this LA contract had been canceled. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's the same where Veda was deceiving everybody just so she could get what she wants. And she also reveals that Monty is in New York waiting for her. So she's just gonna go back, be with Monty, and she is going to get richer and even more famous than she already is. And yeah, this interaction leaves Mildred angry and heartbroken all over again. By the way, angry and heartbroken is how a lot of interactions with Veda end up for her. But Bert, he tells Mildred, he's like, you know what? To hell with her. And Mildred repeats this, and then he suggests they get drunk, and that is how the book and show end, with Mildred seemingly letting go of this obsession she has with Veda. But I want to talk about Bert and Mildred because I did love that they remarry in the book and the show. Because yeah, we just see how he had been so supportive of Mildred throughout the story, and oftentimes he was the one that she would turn to, especially when it concerned Veda, rather than turning to Monty. And he also was very proud of what she achieved and the life she provided for their girls. Again, whereas Monty and Veda, they kind of looked down on Mildred for the fact that she worked for her money. Whereas yeah, Bert was always nothing but impressed and proud. And then I did really like that ending scene too, with him being like, you know, to hell with her, forget Veda, she's bad news, like let's put her behind us. And then, you know, we have Mildred repeating this, being like, yeah, to hell with her. And in the show, you know, they stay truthful to the book where they just end it right after they agree to get drunk. But I kind of wish we had a little bit more. Like I would have liked to have seen her have a drink with Bert and maybe laugh and show show that she really is letting go of Veda, right? Like, see her relax and just be like, you know what? Let's go back to our wedding party. We're going to have a good time. We're not going to let Veda ruin this day or our life. Like, we're putting her behind us, right? I feel like an added minute would have really solidified the fact that she had finally turned a new leaf and wasn't going to be obsessed with Veda anymore. So let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. But yeah, I kind of wish that scene was extended just a tiny bit. And then I did want to share this last scene from the book too. So we read, when the taxi door slammed and it had noisily pulled away, Mildred went to the bedroom, lay down, and began to cry. Perhaps she had something to cry about. She was 37 years old, fat, and getting a little shapeless. She had lost everything she had worked for over long and weary years. The one living thing she had loved had turned on her repeatedly, with tooth and fang, and now had left her without so much as a kiss or a pleasant goodbye. Her only crime, if she had committed one, was that she had loved this girl too well. Bert came in with a decisive look in his eye and a bottle of rye in his hand. In masterful fashion, he sloshed it once or twice, then sat down on the bed. Mildred? Yes. To hell with her. This remark only served to step up the tempo of Mildred's sobs, which were approaching a wail already. But Bert took hold of her and shook her. I said to hell with her. Through the tears and woe, Mildred seemed to sense what he meant. What it cost her to swallow back her sobs, look at him, squint, and draw the knife across an umbilical cord, God alone knows. But she did it. Her hand tightened on his until her fingernails dug into his skin, and she said, "Okay, Bert, to hell with her. God damn it, that's what I want to hear. Come on, we got each other, haven't we? Let's get stinko." Yes. Let's get stinko. And that is just a funny line to end the book with. Let's get stinko. But anyway, now I need to move on to the 1945 movie, because something I haven't even yet mentioned is that the 1945 movie begins with Monty being shot. However, we do not know who shot him, but Mildred is brought in for questioning, of course, and so this whole story is framed as Mildred telling her story to the police. And so when she gets to the point in her story leading up to Monty's death, we see that Mildred here again was having money issues. Though in the movie, Veda wasn't a famous singer here in the movie. And so it was more so because, she still is paying for Veda and Monty's expensive life, but also Monty owns a share of the business and yet he's not helping at all. And so after this meeting, she goes to confront Monty about this, when then she finds Veda and Monty kissing. And then Veda, she gets like very venomous and she's like, "Oh, Monty never loved you. He wants me. We're going to go get married." And so Mildred is very hurt and she leaves and goes to her car, when then Monty turns to Veda and he's like, "I don't love you and I'm not going to marry you." And so Veda gets upset and she shoots Monty. Mildred hears the shot, comes back inside, and of course Veda is able to manipulate Mildred into covering for her. And she then tries to pin the whole thing on a Wally, who again, in all versions, Wally is kind of a scumbag, but yeah, she tries to pin the murder on him, but this does not go well, and eventually, like I said, she and everybody else is brought in for questioning. And so when Mildred is talking to the cops, she is taking the blame. She is saying that she is the one that killed Monty. However, Veda rushes in and she ends up confessing herself. And so ultimately, despite Mildred trying to cover for Veda, Veda ends up being arrested and put in jail. And then when Mildred leaves the station, we see Bert had been waiting outside for her and the two leave together, possibly implying their renewed romance like we had in the book. And in the movie, the 1945 movie, Mildred is definitely portrayed as the long-suffering mother trying to provide for her spoiled daughter, right? Whereas in the book and show, especially the book, it definitely was not that black and white, literally, because the movie is in black and white. But yeah, in the book, it was a bit more complicated because Mildred seems to always have been obsessed with Veda in some weird way. And I'm not sure which came first, Mildred smothering Veda or Veda manipulating Mildred, but either way, they are just in this horrible cycle with each other. And a scene that portrays this really well in the show is after a music teacher insults Veda, she goes into her room and locks the door to get some space, but Mildred just grabs the spare key and barges in, not giving Veda the space she wants. And in the book, there is a part after she kicks Veda out of the house after she blackmailed that boy. We then get a scene that reads, "Leaving Veda alone was something that hadn't entered her mind, but after she cooled off, she thought about it. However, she was incapable of leaving Veda alone. In the first place, she had an honest concern about her. In the second place, she had become so accustomed to domineering over the many lives that depended on her that patience, wisdom, and tolerance had almost ceased to be part of her. And in the third place, there was this feeling she had about Veda that by now permeated every part of her, that colored everything she did. To have Veda play the piece about rainbows just for her was delicious. To have her scream at her was painful but bearable, for at least it was she that was being screamed at. To have her lying there on a bed, staring at the ceiling, not even thinking about her, was an agony too great to be borne. And then also in the book, we get a line after Ray dies where Mildred thinks like, oh, I'm so grateful it was Ray who died and not Veda, because Veda had always been her favorite. And wow, like that is cold. Ray was so sweet and so cute. How could you say that? But yeah, Veda, she's a manipulator, and manipulators are so good at making people obsessed with them in a weird way, right? And it works because Mildred is obsessed with Veda, and she's so easily controlled by Veda. And there are times again when Veda's very cruel, but then other times when she is sweet and nice. But I wasn't buying these moments for a minute. Like Veda is just being a phony anytime she does something nice for Mildred. She's just telling Mildred what she wants to hear while Veda lies in wait to get what she wants. And there's a quote that goes something like, when someone shows you who they really are, believe them. And Veda shows Mildred who she truly is time and time again, and yet Mildred refuses to believe that side of her, and instead she's a sap who believes Veda is sincere when she does nice things for Mildred. Like when Veda sings the song Mildred likes at the end of her Philharmonic concert, and Mildred is so touched by this. But she didn't actually do that because she cares about Mildred, right? Like she always has ulterior motives when she does anything nice. But speaking of the concert, there is a scene when Mildred looks at Veda through binoculars and she sees Veda singing with a very mean expression on her face. Like it must have been an intense moment in the song. But Mildred is bothered by this expression and she puts the binoculars down. But when the song is done, she is still there enthusiastically cheering Veda on with everybody else. And so I feel like this is very symbolic, right? And so maybe it represents the fact that Mildred does see this cruel side of Veda, and yet she chooses to look away, right? She chooses to figuratively put the binoculars down so that she doesn't have to see that side of Veda, and instead chooses to shine the light and focus more on the good sides of Veda. But the show also kind of includes like the weird sexual undertones to Mildred's obsession with Veda. For example, after she marries Monty, Veda comes to live with her, and we get a scene in both book and show where Mildred sneaks into Veda's room and she kisses her quote unquote hard on the mouth. And we also read how Mildred's reactions are more akin to how a lover would respond, more so than a mother. So yeah, the show does kind of touch on that, but I think the book gets into it even more. And there's that line earlier where Kane wrote, let me find it. Her only crime, if she had committed one, was that she loved this girl too well. And so that's the ambivalence that quote was talking about earlier, because on one hand, he's saying her only crime was loving her too well, which is a reference to Shakespeare. But at the same time, throughout the story, like Mildred also has her own issues, and she's also so obsessed and has these weird reactions to Veda. And so again, it's almost not clear how Kane feels about Mildred. Sometimes it seems like she's partly to blame. Other times he writes as if she was innocent in everything. But, it's complicated, which I kind of like that about the book too, though, right? Because life is complicated and things aren't black and white. And so, yeah, anyway, very interesting dynamic, especially in the book, because there are just so many more layers. But before I wrap up, I need to talk about Ida and Mrs. Gessler, because along with Mildred being an awesome 1930s feminist businesswoman, we also have Mrs. Gessler, her neighbor and friend, as well as Ida, a woman Mildred befriends at the diner. And unfortunately, in the 45 movie, Mrs. Gessler is cut entirely. But in the book and show, she is there helping Mildred throughout the story, and she helps at the restaurant. And then when Prohibition ends, she encourages Mildred to get a liquor license, and she's like, I will be your bartender. So I thought that was pretty cool. And then again, Ida, she knew from the diner, but then on the night of Mildred's grand opening, things are hectic. It got busier than Mildred thought. Her staff is not doing well. And then Ida walks in, and without having to be asked, she whips things into shape and helps Mildred get through the night. And I loved this scene in the book and the show because they did such a good job at making you feel the stress and the pressure Mildred is feeling as things are getting out of hand and her employees aren't doing great. You also feel that relief and gratitude when Ida comes in, again, without even having to be asked. She just notices what's happening, and she comes in the kitchen and she helps Mildred get through the night. And yeah, that was a fantastic scene. And Ida and Mrs. Gessler Gessler both end up running their own Mildred chains later in the story. And at the end of the book and show, Mildred loses her company, right? She wasn't able to get the money from Veda the way she intended, right? And so she ends up being kicked out of her company, and Ida is the one who takes over because that is who the creditors chose to take over. However, she and Ida do stay on good terms though. And in fact, in the end of the book and show, Ida is talking to Mildred and she tells her like, hey, ever since you left, the pies haven't been as good. So she is encouraging Mildred. She's like, I know it's bad to stir up competition, but you should start making your pies again and selling them. So it seems like Mildred will get back to her roots, back to pies at the end of this story. But when it comes to book versus movie versus TV show, this is really tough because I do love all three. And again, the show is so faithful to the book. It's just a fantastic adaptation. And it's one of those adaptations where after I watched it, it made me like the book even more, which then made me like the show even more, which then made me like the book even more. And it causes that cycle, you know? Whereas the movie is fantastic, but again, it is very different in many ways. It's not the most unfaithful adaptation I've ever seen, but yeah, they do make some big changes. You know, noir was a very popular genre at the time, and so they add the murder mystery noir aspect, and Veda here is the femme fatale who is, you know, seducing and bringing Mildred down. Although, of course, in the end, Veda is the one brought down, but that is due to the censors because a villain couldn't get away with their crimes, right? So Veda had to pay for her actions at the end. And yeah, I just don't know how I feel about Veda actually going to jail in the end. Like, on one hand, you know, I hope Veda rots in that cell because she is a horrible person. But at the same time, I liked how in the book and the show, Veda, she's such a terrible person, and yet she gets away with it, right? Like, every bad thing she is able to manipulate in order to work in her favor. And so in the end, again, she gets to go to New York City and be rich and famous, and she's with Monty, and every bad thing just ends up working out for her. And so I hated that she does so well, and yet that's partly why I liked the book so much as well as the show. So I hated it in a good way, right? Whereas, yeah, in the 40s movie, they couldn't have Veda get away with what she did. Not only like crimes, like she couldn't get away with murder and not be caught, but also one of the codes in place was that they couldn't make an evil life look appealing. And so that is why she doesn't become a successful singer, and instead she is like this undignified lounge singer because they couldn't have a wicked character become rich and famous. And then also in the book and the show, she gets away with blackmailing that boy's family. She gets the money. Whereas in the movie, Mildred finds out she was lying and Veda is holding the check, and Mildred rips up the check. So Veda never gets the money. And again, this was because the code set in place said that Veda could not get away with this treacherous act and she couldn't actually succeed with her plan, right? And so it is so interesting the way movies had to appease these codes. And I still think this movie is fantastic. But again, I kind of missed seeing Veda just get away with it all again. But yeah, when it comes to comparing the three of them, I guess I would say the movie comes in third, but then as far as the other two, I think I will just kind of almost go to default and just say that the book wins ultimately. But again, the TV show is so good. And if you like the book, I highly recommend the show because it's a fantastic adaptation. But yeah, ultimately, I'll say the book wins because again, there was just so many layers and so much depth to these characters and these relationships. And honestly, like, originally, I think I gave the book 3.5 stars, but the more time I have spent with it and talking about it and thinking about it, the more I love it. So it definitely would be 4, maybe 4.5 stars. And then yeah, the TV show and the movie are also fantastic. Even if the movie does make its own changes, it's still one I would highly recommend. So yeah, I guess that wraps it up for Mildred Pearce. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. And it's also kind of funny, you know, Thanksgiving is coming up, and Thanksgiving is when you gather with families. So it's funny that I'm covering one that talks about a very toxic family dynamic. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you next time. Bye.